Hi, friends, and welcome to another episode of The Blunt Writer. Today we are discussing, well, as a writer, how vulnerable should you be? And there are a couple of contexts over here. So the first one I think is pretty obvious. People are thinking, well, if I'm writing non-fiction, especially in the memoir, personal essay category, and we're seeing a lot of that, especially online these days, and also in collections. Um, well, how vulnerable are you supposed to be, and how are you supposed to bring out the most personal parts about your life and write about them? And what does that really mean for us as writers? Why are people doing that so much, or why is it being highlighted so much right now in the writing world? Well, I am a firm believer that personal memoirs and personal essays can really have profound impact on people and therefore the world. But it is, of course, in the nuances as to what makes it well done and what is the purpose of it. And now this also applies to fiction, and I'll come to that in a little bit. But I'm going to, kind of set the first part over here in terms of nonfiction. And so, the first question you want to ask yourself is, well, what is this pressing need that you have to share that is either, deemed as taboo, wherever, you're coming from, or, why are you sharing something that is very personal? And how is this going to connect with the world? I would say, how would this help people? But then that seems a little too philanthropic, because writing is not always philanthropic. But how is it going to connect to the world? And I think that's a better and stronger more word. And so more importantly, how are you going to use this personal insight to extend to your larger world? And how can you, thematically use something that is super specific to your life to kind of show the larger narrative of what's going on in our world? And that's what it comes down to, guys, because what happens is that sometimes we just think we have content or something that is, really gossipy, or really, if you're writing about sex maybe, or you're writing about something that, or much darker themes like mental illness and abuse. And it feels like, okay, so here's something that people, we are voyeurs. At the end of the day, humans are voyeurs, and we love to read about other people and other situations that, that we might not talk about in our own personal capacity, but we love to read other people when they do that, right? So how do you make that more impactful? A really good example of this is, when you go online and you see the way we kind of reduce the whole idea of poverty to this really stereotypical picture of a starving child, usually a starving child from the continent of Africa, or an Indian, South Asian child looking, starving, and saying and asking for you to please give money to a certain charity so that these children can be fed. Now, what happens over here is that this is a voyeuristic trick. You're reducing the idea of what poverty is, how it's sustained in a capitalistic society like this, where we are consuming and consuming, and only a certain section of society goes up and up and up, while the wealth inequality and access to resources go drastically low for a huge part of this globe. And we don't look at it that way. What we look at it is like, oh, I can be a good person and I can give $5 a month or 500 rupees a month and feel better about what I'm doing because I'm passing it on. But you're not passing it on, because there's a whole critique of why, just philanthropy for philanthropy's sake isn't really not making any impact. We're just staying in this one vicious cycle where people are, continually going, reaching places where they cannot access the same resources that an increasingly few amount of people can. So, if you were to write about poverty, or your own experience, for example, with poverty, or, or if you're looking at the structure of it as how we are all participants in it, willingly or subconsciously or consciously or whatever it is, without, it's not like we're born and we intend to be these sustainers of greed. It's not like that, and that's the gray area of humanity, right? So how do you kind of tell your specific story, which is, yes, talking about the gravity of your situation, but also kind of bringing out the structural and the larger world at hand, because that's where you make a strong connection and you go past voyeurism. which is why, when you're writing a story about, say, your divorce, or your struggle with a health issue, or you're talking about your experience with child sexual abuse, you have to go past just the incident, right? Because otherwise, what people are coming there to just read that one incident, and then take a voyeuristic pleasure. It's like, remember when we used to read those magazines where they would have the tell me your crazy sex stories, or you need personal advice, and we just read those little clips of stories and say like, ooh, that's happening in that person's life, ooh, I can't believe that person did that. So it's like, that's our voyeuristic sense. But then how do you go to level 2 as a writer, which is saying, I'm taking this one example, I'm being vulnerable over here and sharing something, but then I am also taking this and extending it to the larger world. So suppose you were writing about child sexual abuse and your own experience with it. For example, are you also talking about why, as a society, say in India, it is especially hard to acknowledge this publicly because of the familial systems that we have, because of the power structures that we have in families, because of patriarchal notions of who gets to talk and who gets to acknowledge something publicly in a family setup, because we all have these kind of connections where we don't really confront issues as Indians, especially when it comes to sex, because there is so much of shame involved with it. And of course, this also applies globally, but I'm just talking from a very Indian context. But so would you be talking about that? Would you be, predicting numbers in terms of how many kids are abused every year? Because these are real things that are happening. And this is how you make the larger connection of just an incident to something that is to the larger world, and that's how you invite the reader in as a participant of the good, the black, the ugly, the gray, everything. And that's what a strong writer can do, is to invite the reader in. So when you come and you ask me like how vulnerable you should be, is that I think you have to be as vulnerable as you're comfortable being, but you have to think through how you're going to connect it to the larger world, why you're saying it, how you think it's going to connect to people or help people. And you might not have these answers right there and then. And it could take years. For example, I wrote an essay about 3 years ago about my first marriage, which was, yes, abusive. And, but if you asked me 8 years ago if I would ever write about it, I'd be like, are you nuts? I'm never writing about that. But then, 3 years ago, it came very naturally to me. And I said, I know why I'm writing this essay. And I know who it's going to connect to. And I know what lens and awareness that I'm going to write it with, which is a very retrospective lens of saying, how young women are brought up, and how, I take stakes in those choices that I made, with awareness of what are those prompts that allowed me to want a marriage like that and stay in a marriage like that for a bit, and then ultimately what allowed me to get out of that. And so, and it was very hard to write, but it felt very liberating at the time when I published it. So, but it took me years to get to the point where I felt comfortable to write it. So just because you have some good content, you might have to wait on it for the right time for you to understand why you're writing it in the first place. Now, how this kind of ties in with fiction? Well, fiction is, you might be using a hot topic, a hot taboo subject, or using your own personal life. And I'll do another video on, autobiography and fiction. Like, a lot of first-time writers tend to use a lot of their own personal life experiences in their book, and that's a separate subject. But, irrespective of that, I feel like all writers, no matter what, are putting in some of their worldview in the book, or some of the things they're negotiating or thinking about. Even if they put it as like something bad in the book, it's something that they're thinking about. And that's really important, again, to understand why you're putting certain subjects. Is it just because it's a trend? Is it just because you feel like it's a topic that you've always been wanting to, kind of put into a book? So the same questions apply. Like, are you using certain topics just for the voyeur effect? Just for the fact that somebody is going to read it because you said these 3 words? It's about serial killers. I mean, that's a really bad example. But, is it about an abusive marriage, just, and is that the what you're trying to hook people on? I'm not saying that hooks don't exist and you need hooks. Of course you need hooks, but when you're writing the entire thing, is that the only reason you're writing it? How are you going to connect it to the plot, to the story, to the larger themes that the reader is going to feel when they read the book? So it's kind of the same equation there, but we just plus and minus a few things on that equation in terms of plot and narrative, in terms of why you're doing it, in terms of putting in real nonfiction data, research, things like that. That could apply differently on a memoir or on a personal essay, where you'd have to back it up with maybe numbers if you take that approach, if you take that reportage kind of approach. So this is basic. What I want to now talk about is what happens when you start, you write something that's super personal. And a lot of people ask me this is, well, should I change names, and should I not, because this is going to be obvious that this is about my friend, or this is about my mother, or this is about my uncle. And, I think we're really scared about how the world is going to react to our views. If you, especially if you are publishing nonfiction, I have a couple of friends who are publishing books now that are going to be, about people in their lives. And I think it's a very hard call to make. But I think some writers do it so wonderfully, and they know why they're doing it, and that's the beauty of it, because they know that their subject matter and what they're writing is important to connect with the world. And I'm not saying all writers have to do it, because certainly a lot of them can't. It depends on your personality. It depends on, how much you own yourself as a person, saying that, I've done the best I can. I've tried to be honest here. You've not tried to go and, slam someone for the sake of, slamming. And you're trying to be authentic to the complexity of life. Whether you're writing about your ex-boyfriend, if you're just going to write shit about your ex-boyfriend for the sake of writing shit about your ex-boyfriend, I mean, people are going to see through that, right? But if you're writing about it even with awareness of who you were at that time and what you were doing at that time, then it's more real, and then people are willing to kind of accept that in a better way. So there's no real answer to this. It's really about how you define yourself and how comfortable you are with it. And that can change over the years. You can become more and more comfortable with writing your truth. But remember, it's your truth. Even when you're writing memoir, you're writing from memory. Memory is never documented. So how people remember things will always be different. So always have that awareness, and always have that approach that no matter what I'm writing, people might remember it differently. And that's fine, as long as you are honest to your narrative and why you're writing it. Now, when you're writing these types of things and you're going into a reportage mode, or you're talking about other communities and groups of people, here's where you can get into trouble if you are speaking for another community or for another cause without being aware of what your privileged location is, where your social location is. Because if you don't do that with that awareness, you're going to get in trouble. And there are a lot of films and books, and I don't care what country you're in, I'm sure you can pull up a few examples of literature, nonfiction books and movies that have come out recently where people have heavily critiqued why such a movie was made, because it either speaks for another community, or uses social privilege to speak for and take away space from people who don't have platforms to make the same art that certain people can. And so and it's always a tricky situation. So yes, I believe that we should be able to write and produce and create whatever we want, but we have to have that genuine interest in knowing where we stand, so that lens can be applied when we're writing and when we're creating. And when you do that, even if you fuck up, you can at least apologize for it, or you can at least listen to it and say, oh, I see where I made a mistake here. That said, there's always going to be assholes who do whatever the fuck they want anyway and just write shit. And that's, according to me, that's fine, because what happens, and what I've recently seen, is that a lot of good critique comes out of it, and people from those communities and from those spaces or countries or whatever, structure that they kind of spoke for, come back and critique it. And because of that, we have such good conversation in terms of well, how are we fucking up as society, and how are we speaking over people? So, for the assholes to keep doing that without any kind of apology or just unabashedly do that, that's fine. They'll keep doing that, and more critique will come out of it. That said, you still might be slammed even if you have good intention. So just remember, as a writer, we're always prone to that. And as long as you have an open mind and an open heart, an ability to see what makes sense for you and genuinely connect with people, you can always apologize and you can always move on and learn more. And I hope with that positive reality, I hope this made you understand vulnerability a little bit, what context that has in the world of writing. And if you have any other questions, please put it down in the comments box. I will link the essay that I wrote, my most vulnerable essay, in the description box, so you can take a look at that. I hope quarantine is keeping all of you happy and safe, and you're not losing your mind yet. I will be back this week with more videos. Take care.